WNST. Down in Washington, D.C., NLuke Jones has ceded his Major League Baseball press pass to me for 48 hours, and I went on walkabout down at Nats Park. Of course, he's getting ready for Ravens training camp, and back from you have a nice suntan right now, and I know you spent a lot of time at the ballpark last week on the Machado watch, and now that it is entered the 11th and a half hour of this move to the Los Angeles Dodgers, dude, after watching Machado for 2 days down in D.C., I'm happy for him it's over with. I don't have a crush on him, you know what I mean? But I do sort of feel sorry for him. I mean, this isn't normal. This isn't the way this is supposed to work for a 26-year-old player who's the best in the sport. It's kind of shameful, really, when it comes down to it.
Well, I mean, it just comes down to it when you make the major leagues at age 20. I mean, Bryce Harper's in a very similar boat right now. You don't typically see players of this caliber, this age, approaching free agency in the next few months. And I'll say this, and I've said this to you on a number of occasions throughout the season, even going back to the offseason. I think he handled all of the trade talk exceptionally well. He held court with virtually any city that had any inkling of a shred of interest in him and patiently answered questions. And Machado has never been a media-savvy kind of guy. He's the kind of guy that if he had his way about it, he wouldn't talk to reporters just because he doesn't have any interest in doing it. But
he's also afraid of what he might say, too, I think. He seems very hesitant of being one word away from being in trouble, and he doesn't have a good radar for that in retweeting Instagram pictures of him in Yankees jerseys. He's almost a little bit of a troublemaker in that way without realizing it, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was more applicable when he was younger. I think there has been some maturity to him over the last year or two. I mean, even go back to last year. I know he had the rant about the Red Sox, but I still think he overall handled himself much better in that scenario than he did against the late Yordano Ventura, and certainly than he did against the Oakland Athletics 4 years ago when he threw the bat. So we've seen a maturity in him, as you would expect when someone goes from age 20, or when they're still, not legally still a kid, but essentially still a kid, to age 26, where he's been the focal point of the All-Star game, answering question after question about where he's going to be, and I think he did a nice job with that. But now as it's winding down and reality setting in, you do have to think that there's a certain part of him that's really exhausted from all of this. And I've even talking to some people over the last couple of weeks, as much as Manny Machado is looking forward to free agency and getting a 9-figure contract, and who knows what the finances will end up being before it's all said and done, he is still going to miss Baltimore, and he has enjoyed his time here, and he has enjoyed his teammates a whole lot. And
it's all he knows, right? And he has won. Unlike when Brian Roberts or Markakis or Adam Jones had a thought to leave here, there was no crumb. There was no cloud in the sky that said you can win a championship here, even win the division, or even make the playoffs. So, Machado has been here and been a part of whatever the glorious period in your life. You haven't been around as long as me. This is one of those little blips where if you're an Orioles fan for a long time, this was one of the good times, and he was part of that. And it reminded me, I was driving back from D.C. on Tuesday night for the All-Star game, and I thought about, he's going to the Dodgers. Wow, that's where Eddie Murray went. I remember where I was the day Eddie Murray got traded, and I remember what Juan Bell represented in Holton and whatever those guys' names were from 100 years ago, 30 years ago now to be accurate. And I remember how Murray got thrown out here. It was all about racism with Murray, and it was all about him getting chased out of here and being underappreciated and the team being broke and, them winning a World Series and him not being appreciated in the back end and him wanting to go home and all of that. And dude, that was pre-media crush era. It was a big deal around here for 6 months when you knew Eddie Murray wasn't going to be sticking around anymore. And that's kind of the sadness I feel with Machado, that, the place wasn't big enough to contain him. The team never took a run at him. It's standard operating procedure for the Angelos family. And I don't know if Manny Machado would have been a Royal or a Ray or a Pirate or whatever, whether they would have found a way to give him $300 million. I mean, Mike Trout's the only one that sort of has approached that lately. And after the Rangers gave A-Rod all the money, then after that it really has been about the Yankees or the Red Sox giving those kind of contracts. Even the Chris Davis contract, that's sort of a garden variety $150 million deal by Major League Baseball standards. It's not a $300 million deal or whatever Machado's going to get, whatever Stanton got, whatever Trout would get in the open market. That's where Machado, that's the stratosphere he's in. And on a day when the Players Association has declared war on the owners over the collusion of the offseason, this is about Manny Machado getting $411 million if he can, right?
Well, I mean, he's going to get paid. I mean, whatever the final number ends up being, whether it's, I don't know if it's going to be $400 million, but certainly going to be up there with the richest contracts in the history of the game.
Based on last offseason, it won't be, right? Based on that,
but,
right?
But you also have to remember, and look, I'm the first guy that points out how many of these nine-figure deals have been losers, and many of them have. Most of them have, if you really want to break it down and look at it and say whether a deal was really good or really bad or just kind of meh. Most fall into those final two categories. But you have to remember, most of those nine-figure deals have been given out to guys that are 29, 30, 31 years old as opposed to 26. I mean, that's what's so unique about this. I mean, the Marlins extended Stanton, and then you saw what happened shortly thereafter with new ownership. I mean, there's even a scenario, not necessarily if the Orioles had given him a $250 million contract, but let's just say they went the Mike Trout route, which the Angels gave him a 6-year deal in 2014, essentially bought out his first 3 years of free agency. If everything else had played out the same and the Orioles were still 40-plus games below 500 at this point, the right play here still might be to trade Manny Machado. Only the difference is you would have gotten a far greater return with 2 or 3 years of club control. But, at the end of the day, whether the Orioles would have been able to re-sign him or not, or whether this was a case of he wants money and he wants stardom, whether it's going to be in Los Angeles the next couple months and maybe he falls in love with Hollywood and re-signs there, or whether it's in New York, as many people expect when the dust clears in the next few months. It's hard to say whether he would have stayed put, but you'd like to see the Orioles have been more aggressive, been more proactive to at least attempt to keep him around for a few more years. Like I said, even that Trout type of strategy where, you're going to overpay for his last few years of club control, but if you buy out his first 2 or 3 years of free agency in the process, seems like a pretty good deal. But I think you and I have talked about this over and over from the time that he had both knee injuries and subsequent surgeries. For a team that is as risk-adverse, as rigid as they are with their medical reviews, probably any realistic hope of that happening went out the door at that point. So it's unfortunate. I think for me, as I kind of look at this, and look, I mean, this isn't anything that was unexpected. I mean, the writing has been on the wall for a couple years now. I see a lot of upset fans. And look, I understand that. You're talking about one of the most talented players in the history of the franchise. I mean, there's no question about that, regardless of where he ultimately would have ranked if he had played his next 10 years in Baltimore in addition to his first 7. But I think for me it's more a sense of, it's kind of a numb feeling for the organization. I mean, this had to happen at this point, knowing you can't go back and change anything about what happened over the last.
But if you weren't trading him 18 months ago, why were you not trying to engage him and saying, here's $150 million, here's $180 million, what could we do to make you stay? Yeah. Unless you really felt that it was a tremendous waste of time, I would say that's shocking, that a player would come through like that and you wouldn't at least do the dance, whatever the dance would be, to say we gave it our best shot. Nobody can look me in the eye. Machado couldn't look me in the eye and say they put their best foot forward, because they didn't. They didn't put their best foot forward. They're a bad franchise in so many ways, and this thing gets sloughed off. Oh, we couldn't afford him, and he didn't want to be here, and that's the kind of stuff they'll say. But I got up on top of the guy for the first time the other day, and I asked him, and I sensed some disappointment in him, is they never asked me. They never tried. Really? 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 They never tried. They never asked me to marry them. So I'm not marrying them. What do you want me to say? And I sensed a little bit of piss in him over that, a little bit of disrespect in all of that. And all of the reason all of this has happened is because he didn't sign, they didn't sign him, and that's no normal way to run a baseball team if you want to win, to draft a guy third, to have him be the player you want him to be, to have him overcome these injuries, to have him overcome slumps, to have him grow up a little bit and get his head on, and then let him walk out the side door. Shame on the Orioles. That's how I feel about it.
Well, I mean, it just comes down to this. I mean, you just said it. I mean, short of some very brief conversations about 3 years ago that never went anywhere, they haven't. And, I mean, again, and we've debated the merit in giving him $350 million, so we can't be disingenuous in saying that. A year ago, I think both of us were talking about the fact that relative to cost, that Jonathan Scope would be the better long-term investment, understanding you weren't going to have to give him $300 million. So these things can change in that regard, but you would like to have seen some semblance of a real effort to do something. Like I said, even if it was more of not the $300 million contract, but 3 years ago giving him a 6-year, $135 million contract that would have kept him around for 3 more years. Even something like that. I mean, there's no guarantee Mike Trout's going to stay with the Angels beyond, I think, 2020 is when he's signed. But just some acknowledgement of how incredibly valuable this talent is, how incredibly valuable this player is, to either want to keep him around or, and we haven't talked about this nearly as much, in this specific conversation, but we've talked about it at length over the last year or two, or you would have been more proactive in dealing him a year ago or over the off season or 2 winters ago, when at that point they had very clearly made up their mind that they weren't going to sign him long term, to at that point maximize your return. And look, I mean, some of the names that'll be coming back, I think it looks like it has the potential to be a pretty good haul for him, and I thought all along they could get a pretty good deal for him, but certainly not getting 3 top 25 prospects in all of baseball or anything crazy like that.
They're getting fair to middling prospects back that we may or may not hear of, and this kid Diaz is, he'll be the Juan Bell, he'll be the kid we're talking about, and if he's up here playing baseball by 2020 and can be a guy who's on the team for 3 to 5 years, this won't smell so bad. But today it stinks. It really does stink. The whole thing stinks, and when it comes full circle and you realize what's going to happen to Machado in the offseason, and, from the L.A. perspective, and I know you and I, we haven't talked a whole lot about this because 3 months ago it was, the Dodgers weren't going to be involved and they weren't going to deal him to the Yankees, and it was going to be the Cubs, and the Cubs never came. I mean, the amount of breath we've spent on this between the Brewers and, all these other teams that are involved in all of this. This is a smart play for the Dodgers to sort of try him on, right? Like, they get him for 60 days, 90 days or whatever, and if they want to go give him $300 million, they can. And if they don't have to. I thought it was a good play for the Yankees. I thought it was even better for the Phillies to see if they liked him, but I'm sure McPhail and Klentak think they like him, and they think they can go give him whatever they're going to give him at the end of the year anyway and keep their prospects. So good for the Phillies in that way. But I think for an organization to try him on and say, do we really want you around here for 10 years? Do we really want to give you the franchise, $300 million, a third of the value or a quarter of the value of our franchise to play baseball here? You better love marrying him, and this is a nice little date for him out in L.A. First things first, that outfit he wore on Tuesday, he wasn't going to wear that in Philadelphia and get away with it. I promise you that.
Yeah, that outfit was very Hollywood-like. but it comes down to this. I mean, I hear what you're saying on those points, and I think those points have merit, no question about it, because I think anyone who has the financial wherewithal and the ability to lure him there is going to want Manny Machado. So I think the Dodgers are trying to win a World Series. I mean, they came ever so close last year, and we've talked about this from the time that Corey Seager went on the disabled list, and it was apparent after the first month of the season he was having Tommy John surgery. It was clear the Dodgers were going to be a team that were going to be in that conversation. The big question was going to be, would they be willing to probably move around a couple veterans, which I think you're going to see them do to try to stay under the luxury tax threshold. There was lots of discussion as far as would the Orioles send money or not, and depending on what kind of prospect haul they'd get. I mean, all those details kind of shake out after the fact. But when they lost an All-Star caliber player, a former Rookie of the Year, a two-time All-Star, a 24-year-old shortstop, it's kind of like Occam's razor. The most logical possibility is typically the right one, and I think for the Dodgers it made a lot of sense for them. Being a team that was so close last year, being a team that was missing a player at the same position. I think there's plenty of discussion this offseason as far as what position Manny Machado is ultimately going to play and where he's going to stay. But he's going to play shortstop for the Dodgers. They have a need there, and for someone who hasn't talked about it, but has been rumored so much about his desire to play with the Yankees, and everyone saw the Instagram post that his wife liked from his account, and all of that last week. LA is provides a very similar appeal. I mean, my goodness, LeBron James is left Cleveland to go to the Lakers, and they don't have a championship caliber roster right now. So, but it speaks to the appeal that Los Angeles has just in general. So it's going to be interesting for him in that regard. It's going to be interesting for him to kind of be the big fit, no longer be the big fish in the small pond. He's going to be a big fish in an ocean. So
he's got LeBron. He and LeBron are going to be hanging courtside for something.
Yeah,
right?
I'm sure you'll see some photo ops with that. So it's going to be really interesting for him. And again, I want to speak to how well he's handled things this year. And he's going to have to, that maturity that you've gradually kind of seen the last year or two after some not so flattering examples of representing himself earlier in his career. He's going to have to apply that because the pressure is going to be on in Los Angeles. Maybe not in the same way that you think of New York or even the Philadelphia media, but when you're brought in as a hired gun in that kind of situation for the defending National League champions, all eyes are going to be on him to absolutely rake and be the best player on that team for the next 2 months. So it's going to be really interesting in that regard, and it'll be interesting in the meantime of how much he does like it. And as much as everyone's handicapped, the odds in favor of him landing with the Yankees, and I'm not going to change my mind at that point based on him simply going to the Dodgers for a couple months, but you do wonder if the bright lights of L.A. and let's say if they win a World Series or get back to a World Series, perhaps that does sway things in his favor, or it just ends up being a good rental for the Dodgers, who didn't have to give up Alex Verdugo or have to give up their top prospect. They gave up Diaz and other parts that could end up being good players for the Orioles down the road. But hey, you got to give up something to get something. And in the case of the Dodgers, they didn't do something to completely cripple their farm system, but they were able to get a great player for a couple months, and we'll see how it plays out.
Luke Jones is our guest. Baltimore Luke is the way to find him. Luke at WNST.net. He has followed this ever-ongoing saga, and, the sagas are just beginning, right? Because this month, it'll be Adam Jones next week. It'll be Zach Britton the week after that, and Brock leading up to this. You'll be out at Ravens camp. We're going out with Ray Lewis to Cleveland and Canton, Ohio. And then, August and September, they're going to lose a lot of baseball games. They're going to try on a lot of different socks of Quad A players and young players, and they're going to kick the ball around. Scope's going to get asked a million questions about a million things, as is Bundy and Gosman and whoever's left here on the SS Angelos, as I've called it. And then there's going to be Buck and Duquette. And then there's going to be an off-season where they're going to be like Siberia. They're not going to sign anyone. There's going to be no big names coming here in the off-season. It's going to be about how they regroup this thing. And much like when the Ravens bought those billboards that said Billick on the side, they're going to have to buy a billboard next year that says something on the side of it. And I don't know what that says right now. I don't know that they know what that says right now.
Well, Yeah, I mean, that's a reflection of being 40-plus games below 500 at the All-Star break. I mean, they have to rebuild, and it is going to be interesting to see what happens next. I mean, the most immediate steps are pretty logical here. I mean, Zach Britton, I think he'll be the next one to go. I think we even saw during the last homestand traction was really starting to pick up with him. He's looking much, much better over his last 5 or 6 outings, which is why it was so important for him to get back as early as he did from the torn Achilles to work off some of that rust and get back to looking like Zach Britton. So I think he'll be next. Jones, I still think it's interesting from a salary standpoint, from a position standpoint. I think they'll find a taker for him, but I'm not 100% certain that happens. But I think those are the logical names. Brock, we'll see if someone takes him on. He hasn't exactly pitched well. But for me, it's all the steps after that. We've said for months now, trading Manny Machado, there was no competency to doing that as far as where they stood right now and knowing what they had to do right now, regardless of missteps leading up to this point in time. They knew they had to do that at this point. But now... But
the plan was to do this all along if the plan wasn't to offer him money. Right? If you never offered him money, you knew this was going to happen. So whatever the embarrassment or shine or whatever you get or don't get out of it, this was the eventual. This was the worst case scenario other than a sandwich pick, I guess. And that would have happened if they were 1 game over 500 right now or 2 games under. They'd be in there paddling water, right, if the old man were still sitting upright and saying, we have a chance to win. And they would have wound up getting nothing for them. So 40 games under 500, at least they're going to wind up with Yasniel Diaz and a couple other guys I've never heard of, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've said all along, if there's one, and I hate saying this because there is no silver lining when you're the worst team in baseball, but compared to them being 2 games under 500 right now and mathematically, even if not realistically, still in the wild card race, I'll take this scenario because you're right. And we saw this play out last year, and we saw this play out in 2015 when they didn't really have that good of a chance, even though mathematically speaking they were still in it. So from that standpoint, it's, I don't want to say good, but at least played out in the way it did. I mean, the worst case scenario is that they would have hung on to him and they would have made some kind of the second, third tier kind of trade to try to augment their roster. That wouldn't have moved the meter. I mean, we've seen that play out before. So from that standpoint, it was good. I mean, going back to what you just said, I mean, I think as much as we have talked about the fact that they should have dealt Machado much sooner, it is difficult from a standpoint of in 2016 they made the wild card game and they were coming off of a playoff appearance and they had won 89 games. So that winter, I think even though there was plenty of merit to the thought of trading him at that point in time, when some team would have had 2 years of club control, you're also talking about coming off of a playoff season. And you're talking about when you trade a Manny Machado that maybe it's not a full-blown rebuild, but you're certainly resetting and reloading. So that's a tough sell. And I think that's even a tough sell to a fan base if everyone's being honest in the moment.
But I think there was some embarrassment about 18 months ago had they dealt him at the Washington winter meetings or had they dealt him 8 months ago. It would have looked like some sort of concession or white flag. What the hell does 40 games under 500 giving him off to the Dodgers at the All-Star game and turning the thing into the biggest story at the All-Star break? Your effed up organization giving away your 26-year-old kid at the end when you get the least amount for him. How is this somehow a better look than dealing him 18 months ago for something legitimate? I mean, that
was... They don't have a crystal ball. No one, and absolutely no one. You, me, Keith Law, the most critical Orioles analysts or critics or fans, gloom and doom, whoever, no one thought they were going to be 40 games below 500 right now. No one. So from that standpoint...
I thought they would have been 10 or 12. I thought there was a good chance. There was a good chance this year they weren't going to be any good at all. And then they got the pitchers. And I think when they bought the pitchers, we thought, well, I mean, it gives them a breathing chance to go hit the baseball a little bit, right? Literally, right?
Sure. But that's what I'm saying. But that's why. I mean, if they had known 18 months ago they were going to be 40-plus games under 500 now, I think they would have traded Manny Machado. But no one has a crystal ball. No one has a crystal ball to see something that horrendous is going to play out. Now, that said, sure. I mean, you go back to for me, the time would have been to really start looking at this a year ago, big time. I would have at least started considering it 2 winters ago, but they were coming off of a playoff team. Two winters ago is when I would have dealt Zach Britton. Machado, that would have been when I kind of began that process and then seen how 2017 would go. And they weren't in it at the trade deadline, and I would have had the Manny Machado sweepstakes a year ago. And who knows what they could have gotten at that point in time with having him for an extra year and also with the qualifying offer possibility for his new team under that scenario. I mean, the return could have been far more lucrative. And look, I mean, by a lot of accounts, it seems like they got a pretty good return. I think Diaz is, by a lot of different talent evaluator, pundit types out there, Baseball America types and all that, he's an ascending talent and sounds like he's got a chance to be a really good player in the not-too-distant future. But you still didn't get nearly what you could have from Manny Machado. So I absolutely a lack of forward thinking, a lack of vision, but we've talked about that on a number of issues. I mean, my goodness, this team had a general manager orchestrating this who is not under contract beyond the end of September. So, I mean, it just speaks to not having a plan, not having your ducks in order, not being able to think about a year, 2, 3 years down the road.
Not managing your assets, period,
sure,
right? Like,
sure,
not
no
managing your best assets.
Sure. So, I mean, it's just, look at Machado. Look at Zach Britton. If they had traded Zach Britton after a historic 2016 season, they would have gotten better than an Aroldis Chapman return as far as what he could have been at that point. So, I mean, you can look back at it and pick it all apart, and it's justified. But, as far as the whole, is this scenario better for them than holding on to him 18 months ago? Of course not. But no one thought they were going to be this horrendous. I mean, I didn't think they were going to make the playoffs this year, but I picked them to win 82 games. I think you had them at 85, and how much of that was reading too much into getting Alex Cobb and Andrew Cashner? Yeah, that was part of it, but they also had a bunch of players that had just horrendous seasons. Guys are having career-worst seasons. Chris Davis looks like a completely lost cause. They've had injuries to basically every phase of their team other than the starting pitching, really, unless you want to count Chris Tillman, which I'm not going to. But I mean, they had a flawed roster. We knew that. No one thought this team was going to win 98 games, but all their flaws have been compounded by worst-case scenarios in virtually everything you could imagine. From older players looking really old to young players like Trey Mancini and Jonathan Scope taking big steps backward, to Dylan Bundy and Kevin Gausman looking okay and fine, but still not taking that step forward that you've kind of been waiting for. So, you kind of compound all that with a tough schedule in the month of April, injuries. I mean, you go down the list, and then you start to see why this thing has been such a disaster and why, with all of those things going wrong, it's kind of difficult to envision this kind of worst-case Armageddon-type scenario. But here we are, and Manny Machado's heading to Hollywood, and the Orioles are dealing with the fallout and remnants of a last-place team and selling off other pieces. And, oh, by the way, they should also be considering moving some guys that aren't just pending free agents. I don't expect it to happen, but you look at guys like Kevin Gausman and Dylan Bundy and Michael Givens and Jonathan Scope, not now necessarily, but maybe this winter. And you go down the list of some of their other younger players that are under control. This team's not going to be winning for at least a couple years, if not much longer than that. So how much value is it to have Kevin Gausman in your rotation right now if you can move them and go get some younger pieces that are going to be around for 6+ years or longer than that if it's someone still in the minor league? So, that's where, for me, the next questions lie. trading Machado was always going to be the easy part as far as knowing what to do. It was very clear-cut what you had to do. What happens after this from a trade standpoint to establishing who's going to be your general manager, who's going to be your manager.
Who's going to be your owner?
Well, that, yeah, of course. I mean, that's at the top, but whoever is calling the shots at the top, establishing a clear chain of command, hopefully tapping into the international market in the future. They're going to have a lower payroll. There's no doubt. I mean, they're saving money by, Colby Rasmus walked away, Machado being dealt, Jones, Britton, go down the list. They're going to be saving money immediately and in the near future. So hopefully, and I don't want to see that money spent on veteran free agents at this point, pump that money into player development and the international market finally with the thoughts of, yeah, you're going to stink for the next 2 or 3 years, but hopefully after that, some young players start to come through, start to develop, and in the meantime, you're really filling in that pipeline with a lot of great international talent, or at least good international talent. My goodness, you don't have to be number one in spending. Just don't be last. How's that for a starting goal? And if they do some of those things, then things could look better around here in 2021, 2022.
That's a long time from now. And that's the part that really saddens me for you, for me, for what we do for a living. The last 5 years around here since Jen got sick and I've come back on the air, it'll be 4 years next week, or next month, excuse me, that, I've been doing this every day, all day. This has been at least interesting and fascinating and conversational. Yeah. I don't know what the hell we're going to talk about around here the next 2 years that's going to be interesting to fans when the team's ceiling is 74 wins, literally.
Yeah, I mean, it's that rebuilding stinks, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago as far as the struggle in not wanting to trade Manny Machado 2 years ago.
Well, that's why I've done all this baseball this month with the Peter Principles and the Dear Orioles letters, because I'm not going to have a lot to say, other than when Buck and Duquette go away and whatever. And the Ravens might be 7-3 at that point. We hope so, right? Or 7-4, whatever it's going to be, on December 3rd when we're trying to figure out the winter meetings and whatever is going on around here. But boy, baseball is about to go into a very gray area here, and I'm not going to be labored as what I saw in D.C. over the week. I'm going to be writing more about it in these letters to Duquette and to Buck Showalter down the line. Chris Davis is going to get a letter from me. Adam Jones is going to get a Dear Orioles letter before the weekend's over. But I'm very, very concerned about the future of the franchise. And these next 2 or 3 years, they can't they can't become the Expos. And I'm really, really concerned that that's the direction this thing is going into from a PR and a marketing and a Q standpoint in Baltimore, that the Orioles can't become the Expos or the Skipjacks, for lack of a better expression.
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be the concern when you go through a rebuilding. There's no doubt about it. And let's face it, I mean, even a couple years ago when they were still contending, attendance wasn't where you'd like it to be. If you're the organization, if you're someone who's invested in Baltimore. But you got to work harder. And, things like they've done this year with letting kids in free, there needs to be more of that kind of stuff. And that's not to say you just give everything away, because, yeah, it's a business, but you need to give people incentives to go out to the ballpark. I mean, this past Saturday was a great example of that. They gave away a really cool-looking Maryland flag script Orioles jersey, and guess what? They had nearly 40,000 people there. You're going to have to do more of that stuff. You're going to have more promotions and more bells and whistles to try to get people to the ballpark as much as you can. And you're not going to be number one in attendance. You're not going to be top 5 in attendance. But to your point, if you can avoid being last or next to last, then you're hoping that some of the young players that they do still have, and guys like Cedric Mullins who are knocking at the door, and some other really good minor league talent that are 2 years away or 3 years away that they do have at lower levels in their system. You're hoping that those guys pop, and if they do, then this team has a chance to be decent, say 3 years from now, and be ascending at that point in time. But in the meantime, it's going to be ugly. There's no way to sugarcoat that as far as on the field. It's really going to be a case of looking for individuals to show promise. Cedric Mullins comes up and establishes himself as a leadoff hitter and a bona fide major league center fielder, and maybe he doesn't become an all-star, but is at least a good everyday player, then that's something. And then you look for the Mountcastles and the Austin Hayes, and players they got from the Dodgers, and players they're going to get for Zach Britton, and not all of them are going to pan out. That's reality, but you're hoping that enough of them do that come 2 or 3 years from now, the outlook is looking better than it does right now, because it's not easy to sugarcoat how bleak it does look. And again, it starts at the top with establishing some stability as far as what ownership is going to look like in the coming years, and more importantly, from a baseball standpoint, figuring out who's going to run baseball operations and letting that person doing it, and having a clear chain of command, and having a commitment to player development in the international free agent talent pool, and doing all those things to build a successful organization. This team had a good run. Up until last year, 2012 through 2016 was a heck of a lot of fun.
And you know how that happens? Good baseball players. That's how that happens, right?
And that was a credit to Andy McPhail, and it was a credit to Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette for the things they did when they got here. So, but that time is, that window slammed shut pretty emphatically last September, and Manny Machado walking out the door just puts the lock on the window. It's time to start turning the page in that regard and trying to figure out how you're going to fix this thing, because it's not going to be something that happens overnight. And I think back to, and this is something I'm going to write at WNST.net, that when Manny Machado was called up in August 6 years ago, August 9th, against Kansas City, I think it was at the time, that was a team that I think was 8 or 9 games above 500 at that point. And remember, in 2012, what were we thinking all year? You're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're waiting for them to have their collapse. You're waiting for them to come back to earth. And they hadn't done it to that point, but very few people had really believed in them at that late stage in the season. Manny Machado coming up as a 20-year-old and doing the things he did defensively right off the bat, which, remember, Wilson Betemit was their third baseman that year. Terrible defensive player. Right away, he turned a weakness into a strength, and he just brought this hope with him. Really the same hope that Matt Wieters brought a couple years before that, but Wieters never became the superstar Hall of Fame kind of player, even though he was an all-star catcher. Manny Machado was that superstar. He brought that hope, and that hope walked out the door officially, or whatever was left of that hope, knowing this team has been awful this year, walked out the door this week, and the Orioles have a heck of a lot of work to do to recreate that hope and get people excited about Orioles baseball again, because it's not going to be happening anytime soon based on the results on the field.
All right, he is NLuke Jones, Baltimore Luke, out on Twitter. He goes from baseball Luke to football Luke, and I'm wearing my football shirt today, Luke, so I know you got your SPF ready, right, for all things Owings Mills, right?
Oh, there's no question about it. Being at the beach a couple weeks ago gives you a good practice for making sure you're sunscreened up and waiting for training camp to start, and certainly going to be, in my mind, regardless of where you fall on the whole Joe Flacco, Lamar Jackson conversation, going to be the most compelling preseason we've seen in a long time. Even if Lamar Jackson doesn't sniff the field as a quarterback this year, and maybe even next year, who knows? Maybe Joe Flacco goes out and has a career year. But watching Jackson in the preseason alone, far more compelling fake football than we've seen in these parts in a long, long time.
Nasty, I don't care about no Manny Machado and the Orioles anymore. I need some Ravens. It's Raven season. So, the Orioles aren't winning anything. They're just a pile of rubble at this point that we're going to warm our hands around to try to figure out football season, because that's what matters right now. But I'm not done with the Orioles, Luke. You know that. The Dear Orioles series continues. Luke is on the fields in Owings Mills. I am around on the internet, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram. You can find me at King Discount Liquors in a Free the Bird shirt. That is unairable at this point as well. I'm in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day. If you're looking for any of the Dear Orioles letters, they're all there. The Peter Principles, they're all there. The Masson series for dummies, all that's there as well. I've been doing a lot of reading. If you've been listening to AM 1570, you know that. But we are now about to buckle in for training camp, for football, for the end of baseball season, and anything else that's coming down the pipe. You got us covered. WNST.net. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We are WNST.net AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.